Right away, we'll start with our first guest today. We're very, very excited about him. He is a current recipient of the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum Lifetime Achievement Award. He's described by Fortune magazine as an intellectual hedonist with a hummingbird mind. He created the TED conference in 1984, and he coined the term information architecture. Please welcome to the stage Richard Saul Wurman.
The people in the back, could you move up front a little bit? I'll wait a minute. I don't spit when I talk, and it makes it more intimate, and I can see people. And you should actually come to the front and forget about reserved seats on the front. That's silly stuff. Just move down and let's have a conversation, all right? Oh, it's really silly. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. That was very nice. And anybody obviously can get up at any time and leave if they're not interested. You don't have to be interested in what I'm talking about. I'm sometimes not interested in what I talk about. I'm 77 years old. I'll tell you that because sometimes there'll be some generational gaps between an illusion I make or what I say and where some of the younger people are from. And I mean, I met a gentleman last night who's going to talk later, and he showed me some of his work. It's beautiful work, beautiful architectural work, and I'd never heard of him. And I don't follow, and I'm an architect, but I don't follow another whole generation of an exploding group of people who are doing beautiful things around the world. I just don't look at that all the time anymore, even though we can. And so I'm not really up on some things, and yet I'm up on other things. And there is a lot in how we're so well connected with visual images more than I can handle. I'm asked to talk about what the future is. I think the future can be. I was thinking how I could sum up the future of design, and in 1990, early 90s, I decided to do a conference in Kobe, Japan, and I was living in New York City in Soho. Can you hear me all right? Okay, fine. And there's about a 11 or 12-hour time difference between those two places. And I don't speak Japanese. I mean, I barely speak English. And the only way I could do it was because there had been an invention of something that very quickly caught on, that everybody seemed to have, and that was the fax machine. Everybody had a fax machine. They didn't have fax machines. And then all of a sudden, everybody had a fax machine. And of course, it only works if everybody has a fax machine, because you have to fax somebody else, right? So all day, I would write notes to Japan. It was a serious conference, 700 people. We had a huge audit on an island off of Kobe. This was before the earthquake. There was a big complex of hotel and, as the Japanese would do it, and a big auditorium. And it was filled, and there was 700 people, 250 people. And this was only the fourth TED that I did. So I'd only done 3 TEDs. But 250 people made the trip to Japan because we thought Japan Inc. was going to take over the world. And they were very curious. And 250 people came from Japan. And we had really top people there, really top people. The head of NTT, which was the largest cap company in the world at that time. It was the largest capitalized company in the world. And he did all kinds of things for me. And the only way I could do that conference was by writing notes all day long, dictating things, because I can't type. See, that's a generational gap. When I grew up, if you knew how to type, then you would never be upwardly mobile because you wouldn't have had a secretary. You were taught not to type, so you would have a secretary, so you would be somebody of more importance. Actually, I not only can't type, I can't do really very much of anything. I have no skill sets whatsoever. And that has helped me enormously. That, combined with my ignorance, has been my long suit. Well, because if you're ignorant, then you want to find out about things. And if you know about things, then you're boring. So all day long, I sent faxes. And all night long, because I worked at home in a big loft, all night long, my fax machine worked, right? And there was, on the floor, there was these sort of rolled up faxes because they came on a roll and they were warm and they heated up, and somebody had to put them in order and everything. And that's the way I did this conference. I could do the conference because of an invention, because of maybe a social invention, a social communication invention. It was really dependent on that. I could not have done that meeting over the phone. And I wasn't going to go there. I mean, I went there every 6 weeks or so. Well, think of the implications of that, where the tool allowed me to do an event, and it was based on that. But here's the kicker. I haven't sent a fax in a couple years. We don't use fax anymore. Something that was an integral part of my creative life is gone. And every other fucking thing that you are dependent on now, that you think is so important, Twitter and Facebook and this and that you can't live without, is going to be gone. So for you to think your life is that, or to think of that's what controls you, or that's what's always going to be here, or that's your staff of life, or that's your dependency, is really, really not agility in your thinking about design. You have to just get rid of that and think of what is the essence of what we do, of how we think, of how we make buildings is going to change. We talked briefly about that last night, just briefly. There was a sort of a cliquey dinner with the speakers. Which, by the way, I'm going to criticize how people do conferences because I've done a whole bunch of conferences. So I'll criticize them, and I would never have a cliquey dinner for this. Everybody should attend everything. Everybody should have common memory. Everybody should see everything. There shouldn't be them and us. There shouldn't be saved seats, I don't believe. And this area here, I just said to this lovely lady here, I just said that you could fight a war in this space here. I mean, look at the way this separates. Look at the difference between when I stood up there and speak and talk to you, and then if I stand back here, or then go here, and then somebody told me that there's not a step going up to the stairs. I think they really thought I was fragile. And I know there's not a step going up. I have to go from the sides, right? And then there's those god-awful flowers there. Now, you can't be in the design business and have those goddamn things there. Are you supposed to look that way? Is that a design point? I mean, design is part of everything we do in our life. This meeting needs to be designed. I think about design all the time. I think about design of how I speak, of how I make points, of what words I use, of how I look at somebody and get their attention or not, or whether they're looking back at me but really looking at the person over there. Everything is designed. I think about things all the time. I wore this Masoni scarf because there's somebody from Masoni here today. Everything is designed. The joke is designed. Humor is designed. What is a joke? A joke is the opposite of expectation. Have you ever thought of that? That's what a joke is. That's what humor is. That's why we laugh. Do you realize what process that is? That's the radical alternative, the opposite of expectation. Opposites are one of the most amazing ways we innovate. Mr. Chow, who runs restaurants, is actually a very bright man. And Mr. Chow this is a paraphrase on what he says. Mr. Chow says, if you say something is true, the opposite is truer. Think about that. Think about that when you design something. When you make a decision in design, you often come to a realization that what makes sense is the opposite of what you're doing. That whole yin-yang, the space between things. We were talking in Venice last night. What is wonderful about Venice? The buildings or the space between the buildings? I'll go for the space between the buildings. I think the space between the buildings in Venice just edges out the buildings. That's the opposite. I know it's a figure field, but it's a way you think. Think in a conversation which we just had with somebody here when I think I was walking out there and I said I wanted the lights in the room up and the lights on me down so I could see you. And we started talking, and then I was silent for a minute. That uncomfortable silence. Think of what that means. How powerful that was just then. And that was just a couple more seconds than usual. But it's powerful. Each of these things are tools that we can use of how we talk, of the design, the big design problem, which is the design of our life. The last TED conference I did in 2002 was, I called it simply the greatest design conference that ever was. I tend to speak in big terms, but it didn't seem to offend anybody, or anybody that would tell me it offended them. And I would have said something nasty about going to somebody's conference that said that, but nobody did. And I divided it into 12 sections, and the last section was the design of your life. And the last part of that section was Frank Gehry. Frank's my best friend. And Frank and I sitting and chatting on the stage, just having a conversation. I just said, now you're the most famous architect in the world. Now what? What do you do then? What are you aiming for? Why do you get up in the morning? What is it you want? And we just talked the way we would talk. And I just ran a conference a month ago called the WWW Conference. That title is too complicated. I mean, who's going to remember that fucking title? I mean, you should just have a title, and you can have a subtitle with all those words, but everybody has to have their name of their thing. You don't need it. You won't remember it. People say, what were you talking about? I'll say a design conference. I won't remember all that. You just have to think of how you design things, how you design people's memories. Everything. So I just ran a conference a month ago, and I realized that how do you innovate? How did I start TED? What did I do? What was the process? And the process was subtraction. Now, this won't resonate with you because you don't know what conferences were in 1980. You don't remember because you didn't go to that, and many people weren't born then, right? Let alone be old enough to go to a conference. But in 1980, conferences were made up of white men in suits sitting on panels who were either politicians or CEOs or would-be CEOs talking about their companies, and usually one subject per conference, near a golf course, standing behind a lectern and giving a long speech after a very long introduction. And you save seats in the front for your sponsors, and that's the way it was. And I couldn't stand that. So I decided to subtract everything. I took away the lectern, because that lectern, what it does is protects your groin. And by protecting your groin, you're making people are giggling, but that's why we sit at tables. It protects our groin. We're not as vulnerable. No, seriously. You're not as vulnerable. You can speak. You can be not open as much. So I took away the lectern. Of course, the lectern also gives you a place to put down a speech. So you can read a speech. Why should anybody be read to? In university, in college, if you can read to it, just give it to them. Don't read a speech to somebody. And then in this last conference, I took away something that I had started to create. By doing these TED conferences, I created a competition of people, and then, of course, the internet came in and the cloud came in, and people started doing more. I mean, we'll see some today. People showing off their presentations with fancy slides and with movie videos and computer graphic things, and we're well past. We make fun of PowerPoint and Keystone now, but they'll do Keystone and PowerPoint. They'll do all these things to distract them from content, actually, distract the audience from them actually being out there talking. And so speakers have, in large, become masters of ceremonies of AV, and they're captions. They become captions to what they show on the screen, right? And they depend on that. That's their crutch. So I decided I could subtract that. I could subtract presentations. I could subtract people telling about their last book. their last idea, their last thing that they're pushing, or a charity, selling a charity, or a cause, or making the world better, right? They could actually have a conversation with the audience. So I took away that in this last meeting. In the first TEDs, I took away all those things I told you about. And I saw that there was a convergence between technology, entertainment, and design, and that one was absolutely dependent on another. And you can't even imagine a time when people weren't aware of that. Trust me, they were not aware of that. That was the first TED I did. I lost money. People didn't know what I was talking about. What was TED? What was technology, entertainment, and design? They always called the entertainment part, they called it education. I don't give a shit about education. It was entertainment. I know it's entertainment that makes information go in, not education. There's a board of education. There should be a board of learning. Learning comes from us wanting to learn, not from a teacher on down. And those of you who are teachers here, I'm sorry. So, I talked about ignorance before. Boy, everybody today is going to have a conversation with somebody else here, even in spite of what I'm saying. And you're going to refer to a building or an architect or a movie or a book, and you're not going to know what the person's talking about, and you're going to go, uh-huh. In other words, you're going to lie to each other. You're going to say, so, how's everything going? A question that you can't answer. So by not being able to answer that question, asking the question is a lie. Keeping busy, like they really care. Or they know that you're going to say yes, and that might be a lie because they know that you're out of work. We are lying to each other all the time about one thing or another. It just slips out. And that makes us not good designers. Because we should design the truth, design our conversation, design our curiosity, design our interest in things. Learning is remembering what you're interested in. I know how glib that sounds, but take apart that sentence. Learning, interest, memory. That's learning. If you're not interested in it, you're not going to remember it. I believe that every person in this room has taken a course sometime in their career that they did well in, that they weren't interested in, and they don't remember anything about it. And I believe everybody in this room has taken a course they didn't do as well in, that they were interested in, that they're still interested in, and remembered that. That's a double-blind test on something. And the only things that drive me are my interests. And my interest comes from my ignorance. I'm interested because, and I pursue it because I'm ignorant about it. And my life is the journey from not knowing to knowing. So therefore, I've done a whole shitload of books, but they're all in different subjects. So my last book was a fable. The one before was Understanding Healthcare, a very serious book, $1 million book that a large drug company gave me a lot of money to do a book, and they never saw the table of contents or what was going to be in it until it was printed and out. There was trust there. And I knew, I came to them and I said, I want to do this book because I'm getting old and I want to know about healthcare. I don't know anything about healthcare. I didn't sell my expertise. Most of you are going around selling your expertise all the time. You're selling it in meetings. Oh, I know how to do that. You know, I can do that. I can give you 10 schemes for this or 4 schemes for that, or I know how to this. And you're selling how much you know. And I'm selling it's how little I know and how interested I am in taking that journey from not knowing to knowing. Therefore, nobody asks me to do anything. Therefore, I am out of the real world. I do not have a career like most people are after, and I am not proselytizing you should be that way fully, the way I am, because it is really terrifying. But a little bit, you should be that way. It always looks greener, somebody else's life. So somebody that has a lot of jobs and people ask them to do things, that looks good. But they hate it because they hate clients. And they hate being told what to do and work for somebody. So somebody like myself who has no clients, I don't have a publisher, I don't have a publicist, I don't have a business manager, I don't have any skills, nobody asks me to do anything, looks like a wonderful life. And it's terrifying. Because everything I do, I have to think up. And then I have to put it out there that I thought it up, and I'm open for failure. So again, there's the opposite. But I look at that opposite and I try to make something of that opposite, of that discomfort. We're all trained in our life to go for comfort. Now, you don't think this is a talk about design, I know, but it is about design. Discomfort is about design. You don't want to do what's comfortable. I just did this WWW conference. It was the best of the 40 conferences I've done in my life. It was absolutely the best. I had a horrible year doing it. I really would not like to live over this year. My thoughtful best friends told me it wouldn't work. And they're good people. They're friends of mine. And they've been to many of my meetings. But they didn't think it would work. I had 2 couches that were, I know I can't walk up there. Oh, there's only one little step. So when you're back there, you think this step goes the whole way. It doesn't. I had 2 very nice couches that were, the other one was right here, facing each other. And they were nice. They had arms. And I had 1 chair there. It was very, and it was just that was the whole stage. And then I had about $800,000 worth of beautiful Chihuly Monoqi, big vases. There was like a forest of things. And it was in a place that nobody would go to. It's in Redlands, California. Nobody here knows where Redlands, California is. At a private auditorium that people didn't even hear about, didn't know about. I did everything the opposite of what you would do for comfort. Comfort, Berlin, people like to come to Berlin. People like to come to some place or to a nice destination resort. I did it in a place that nobody would ever go. And I bussed people from about 10 miles away to a hotel they'd never heard of, called the Mission Inn. And the people who came were very fancy people. It was like, I don't know if you'll know the people, but I can tell you some of the stars you would know, but the other people are equally good. A lot of Nobel Prize winners. There was 50 people came, and we had 25 conversations. And my opening was, welcome to the Great Leap Backwards. Well, what's the Great Leap Backwards? The Great Leap Backwards is that I could have done that same meeting 2,500 years ago in Greece with Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, whoever was talking to each other that week, sitting in a little amphitheater with no AV and having a conversation. There was nothing, there was no screen. I had them take down the screen. It was a beautiful private auditorium. I have a lot of wealthy friends. And it was a beautiful private auditorium, about this size, nicer auditorium actually. And there was no stage. It just went from here, and that was flat all the way to the end. And this, where we sat was this close to the people. That's where we were right here. It was intimate. Everybody attended everything. There was common memory. There was no saved seats, and there was 200 people. And I started off with 2 people there, and I started by giving them a premise, not a question, not an interview, not a theme, because these are wonderful people. They were, I talk with people know Frank Gehry and Moshe Zafti, the architects, but I didn't have those 2 talking together. Frank was talking to a brain specialist, Maserati, and I had one of the best-known columnists in the United States is the top columnist for the New York Times, is named David Brooks. He was talking with Yo-Yo Ma, the celloist. And I started them in a premise, and they just had a conversation, and I got rid of time. There was no schedule. When I was bored with it or I thought it had run its course, I said, next. Well, he says, funny, no, but that's the way a conversation is. You don't talk forever. At a certain point, it's over. You hang up the phone eventually, don't you? That's life. Some phone calls are short and some are long. And that's the way it was. It was human. It had to do with people talking to each other. And there was, throughout the 2.5 days, there was 5 one-hour breaks where everybody could talk to each other very intimately. And I designed all the food. So the food was spectacular. Healthy, you could eat it, and you didn't worry about your DLDs and your HDLs and whatever people worry about in their blood tests. And they said things they never said before, and they thought of things they hadn't said before. And it wasn't in the context of saying, and now I did this, and then I did this, and this is what I want to change in the world. And and how good a person I am. A lot of talks are about how good people are. They're trying to tell you how good they are because they're doing work that is going to change humanity before they change themselves, of course. So, I'm also interested in how little we know about the effect of natural events, not all our ego involved in man-made events, but how events that occur change things, and the history we know is written by historians, and it's not written by the truth often. And I got into a discussion on stage where somebody brought up something, and I just had to say, I said, we're not too far from France. I looked on the way in. I asked what those two buildings were, and one is the French cathedral, and one is the German cathedral, to show how much they wanted to work together. And obviously that didn't work out very well. But there's two twin cathedrals in this city, or chapels. And I know I've grown up with thinking that the French Revolution sort of came out of the American Revolution, giving them permission to have a revolution by having our own revolution. And it came out of the aristocracy and wanting to overthrow the king. And more recently, I've come to realize that perhaps, if not the main cause, a very important cause of the French Revolution was something called Larky. It looks like the way it's spelled, it looks like lackey, L-A-K-I, but it's pronounced Larky. And Larky, you remember 3 years ago or so, or 4 years ago, there was a volcano that went off in Iceland, and it spewed forth pumice up there, and it closed down the system for a few weeks. Well, just to the east of that, about 70 miles, is another volcano in that same ridge of volcanoes in the south part of Iceland, that's doming now. It's growing again. But in 1783, Larky went off. And it went off in 1783, 1784, and 1785. And because of the air currents that we know come across there, the jet stream, and then comes down across Europe, and then goes all the way down across Europe to the Nile Valley, it threw up so much of a sulfuric-laden pumice that it changed the agriculture in Europe for a year or so. There was almost 2 years. Great starvation. More than 100,000 people died in France, more than that. Ruined the crops for years. In the Nile Valley and then over into India, 4 or 5 million people died of starvation. You'd never learn this in your history books. And it generated this starvation and being able, it was really disastrous. And we know this happened. And it was written about by Benjamin Franklin, a famous American who was in France at that time. He wrote all about this devastation. And I had never read that in any history book, that was a cause, one of the major causes of starvation happened from a volcano in Iceland. I am so interested in these threads that connect things that we don't learn because our history comes from other sources. And it changes how I look at every subject in my design journey through understanding. I invented a term called information architecture, and I didn't call it information design. And a lot of people thought that was terrible because I was an architect and a designer. I should call it design. I call it architecture because architecture has at least more of a fiction to it, that it is a systemic and thoughtful way of making decisions than design, which is so embraces the look of things. There is in our path, whether we get dressed, we're going to hear from a fashion designer later on, whether we get dressed in the morning or dressed for a movie, or we do a building, there is a moment, there is a little place in the road as we develop our work that we can take a left turn towards looking good or a right turn to being good. And our awards and rewards come from looking good. As a person, we try to look good, not be good. And graphic design, information design, a lot of architecture is awarded and rewarded for looking good, not necessarily for being good. That's what people's reaction to on the surface is a lot. And of course, I think if you try to be good in the deepest sense, it also is handsome. It's fantastic. In fact, it's a new aesthetic. But it's not the aesthetic of just looking good. I was just sitting down and I was showing some pictures of my dogs this morning. I love my dogs. I have 3 dogs. Dogs are astonishing, by the way. The American Kennel Club, which is also the same in Britain, is they divide all dogs. They have these big shows. And we invent dogs. We've created each one of these breeds. And the driver this morning showed me his dog. He has a pit bull. And he was showing me the pit bull. And he loves his pit bull. And many pit bulls are really lovely. And a lot of them aren't so lovely. They're not all bad. But it's usually the problem with the pit bull is at the other end of the leash, not the one that attaches to the pit bull. But there's these 7 categories of dogs that they give prizes to in these shows. And this shows you how much you just put up with things. 2 of those 7 categories, 2 of the 7, one of them is sporting dogs. And there's another category called non-sporting dogs. There can't be 5 more categories. Are you aware? Are you aware that you just watch these shows and you don't question that? Do you realize what's around you that you don't question the absurdity of things? Do you understand what I'm saying? If you have a category called sporting dogs and one called non-sporting dogs, that's all of dogdom. My daily life is looking at everything like that. When I came here, I looked at this being so far back. I looked at those flowers, the couches, the dimensions there, how far you would have to sit there. That's more than 10 feet. You can't talk for more than 10 feet across. That's design. Design is how far you can talk, where you can be to make an intimate contact with another person, how far you can be and see somebody's face and see them nod. We don't have Why isn't somebody working on a computer that can nod? So we know that we're interacting with it. Why don't we design the things that have to do with ourselves and the communication? Why can't we take this great leap backwards and think of the values of things that work? That architecture, the one thing in architecture that hasn't changed is that it's the thoughtful making of space and place. We want to make a space and a place. That doesn't change. I don't care what style, how it's made, or it's gloopy gloop, or it's a big square box, or it's glass, or whatever. We want to have a thoughtful making of space. That's a consistent thing, like conversation seems to be consistent. There are certain things we do that certain things about music are rather consistent. We've had music for quite a while. We started music, I believe, based on our memory. We realized that as we grunted to each other and then put those grunts into some language, and we wanted to put that into our memory system so generation to generation could tell the same story, we put some of these stories to music because it helped our memory. We can remember something if it has a lilt to it and something. That's why a lot of people remember words to songs, because they're put to that music and it helps your memory. And memory and the continuation of our memory is very much part of civilization. And the same civilization came from the fact, I take back the word fact, came from perhaps people sitting around in a circle and realizing that different people around that circle could do different things better than others. Some could make the fire, and some could keep it going, and some could make arrowheads, and some people had babies, some people could tell stories, some people could paint something on a wall, some people knew berries that weren't poisonous, and everybody could do something a little bit better than everybody. They went to something that interested them, and that was the beginning of cities. You realize you didn't have to do everything. I mean, I hate to admit this, but I don't know how to make a light bulb. If you locked me up in a room and said, you have a month, we want you to come out with a light bulb. That's a pretty common thing, a light bulb. I couldn't come out with a fluorescent bulb. And that's even a simpler shape. I can't do anything. But I'm dependent on other people doing everything. You know, I went to school and we thought about the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, and they were so primitive with the Iron Age, and then they had the Bronze Age, which was better. I can't make iron. I wouldn't know where to look and how to make iron. I couldn't make a fucking nail. I'd get a hard stick and a stone and hammer that hard stick into something, maybe. I can't make anything. Do you realize how impotent we are? So I really appreciate the making of everything. One of the people at this last conference was Todd Oldham. He's a fashion guy. You know Todd Oldham? He's a nice man, really nice man. I never met him, just briefly, and I really liked him. And the last thing he said to me, he said, we came to this place in the conversation. He said, if somebody wanted to start in design, not necessarily fashion design, but start in design, I tell them, sew a shirt, make a shirt. That by making a shirt, you really learned an awful lot about design. I mean, how this fits in, all the geometry and the mathematics of it fitting in. How do you make a shirt? I thought, that's really interesting. It's so basic. Just make a shirt. And I'm interested in how that, just how that starts. By the way, we love dogs because they, depending on the breed of dogs, they're between a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. They can't talk. And we love 2-year-olds. The 4-year-olds, the best time in life is when we love our kids the most. And they engender our love the most when they're between 2 and 4. They are, before they get really, really difficult, but are charming and fun to be with. And we see them, burgeoning in this life thing. And their smell is 100,000 times better than ours, and their hearing is about 10,000 times better, and they know between 200 and 400 words, more words than you think. And they look at you and understand nuance about you better than you understand nuance about each other. They know when by the time I go to the front door and go out my front door, which of 3 cars I'm going to get in. They know before I know. They understand the nuance of my walk and what I'm going to do and what I'm carrying. They know those things. We don't give them credit for knowing those things, but their whole job is watching us. My whole job is not watching any other human being. Their whole job is watching us. That's all they do, and they do it very well. I'd love to understand the nuance they understand. I'd love to be with you and understand that quickly all the nuance that I would know so much more about you if I was a dog. But I couldn't tell somebody else about it. Just think of somebody's job just understanding the nuance. Your fingers like this, you're nodding a little bit, you have a smile on your face because I don't know what quite that means. The dog would know that means disdain or love, right? They would know those things. Wouldn't you like to know if somebody really thinks you're a fool or likes you? Or is angry with you, or is putting up? You would know those things if you understand nuance, those subtle nuances of human beings. You could do that with a client. You can understand your client better by those nuances, or how somebody dressed, or what each person is wearing this morning is their choice. And those choices are just really part of my design life. At the turn of the century, turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, there were more millionaires living in a little bump in Mexico, which we generally call the Yucatan. more millionaires, not the richest person in the world, which was at the turn of the century, was Vanderbilt. He died in 1877, and he was the wealthiest person in the world. But right around that same time, there was more millionaires living in that area, because the Industrial Revolution had ships, the first hybrids. They were ships with sails and with motors, steam motors. They were hybrids. And ships going all around the world, taking raw goods and manufactured goods and partly manufactured goods everywhere. That was the big excitement of the Industrial Revolution, was shipping things around the world, goods all around the world, in an explosion of things. And everything had to be wrapped, and there was no duct tape, and there was no corrugated cardboard, and there was no easy way of wrapping things. And so what happened was sisal, which makes twine, became extremely important. I know I'm going to trip. I felt it. I know it. I know it's untied. I know it's untied. I felt it was untied without looking at it, Mama. And I didn't feel like bending down and tying my shoe. But thank you. But I knew it was that way. We'll go on with my story. So, it became a ubiquitous product. Everybody had to have twine. And there's only two places you could grow sisal in Africa and in this, or that they did grow sisal, Africa and the Yucatan. Now, the Yucatan, that bump in Mexico, was not the Yucatan. It's actually 3 states. One is the Quintana Roo, which wasn't made a state till 1915 and was lawless till 1931. And then there's Campeche, which has its capital, Campeche. And the Yucatan, whose capital is Merida. Quintana Roo, the capital is Chetumal. But most of us don't know geography. And certainly I don't know geography of any place that I haven't been. You only start learning geography when you go someplace. As much as you look at maps and things like that, then all of a sudden you think, oh, I didn't know that country was there and this was here. I'm always discovering geography, and I love making maps, and I'll tell you about that in a second. Do I still have some time? I have a little bit of time. I started late. I can speak for 3 hours. I am not. So they built these haciendas, which were complete in themselves, with many acres in a horrible climate. It's pretty dry and awful in Yucatan as far as living climate goes. And they had to have their own schools, churches. They were little teeny narrow gauge railways to bring the sisal around. And they all became millionaires. And then other things came in, wire came in, and cartons came in. And all the haciendas went into ruin. And that whole thing was a flash in the pan. And so there's these beautiful haciendas, some of which have been fixed up quite magnificently by one family in Mexico that bought 100 of them by the name of Hernandez, who owned Bancomex and sold it to Citibank and become very wealthy people. And they're very nice people. And they have 8 or so as hotels. I'm not selling their hotels, but they bought 100 of them. And they're rather extraordinary. But isn't that amazing? A whole set of architecture that came up, went into ruin, came back into hotels, all because of when they wanted to wrap some packages, and they didn't have anything else to wrap them with but twine, sisal. That's an interesting way to study history, and it's an interesting way to see how much things change and how much you can think that's going to be there. I am sure they thought they would always be there. They would always make a living, and they would always be making twine, and nobody would come up with something else. Believe me, that's what they thought. And that's what the lesson of that for you is, that everything you think is here and that you're going to use and become an expert in is not going to be here. It is going to change. And this case for this iPhone is made out of linen, and it's printed. It's printed on a 3D printed. Now, a number of you have seen 3D printing. It's not like magic new, but you don't have it in your home yet. And a lot of people don't do 3D printing. And I just showed it to this young lady in the front row, and I said, this is going to change her business, because we're going to be printing things in a different way. And you can make things. It's going to make you think up things that you wouldn't be able to think of before, much as the fax machine allowed me to do something I couldn't think of ever doing. So I'm going to throw this out. I won't hurt anybody if they catch it. And then just pass it around for a few people and get it back to me, please. It was made for me. It has lots of little W's on it for me. It's just a one-off thing. But you can't even understand how it's made. You can hold something, simple little thing in your hand, and you can't understand how it's made, these intertwining things. I'm just going to throw it out there. Okay, yeah. And just pass it around. You see what I mean? That's going to change fashion, architecture, a lot of stuff that you can will allow you to have a waking dream, allow you to dream of things you can't dream of because the availabilities of making something come. That affects you also. It is not a design, and it's not a magic pill, but it allows you to think of things you couldn't think of before. Much as Lou Kahn drew with charcoal, drawing charcoal on yellow trash paper affected what he could design by rubbing things out, and it affected the look of his things. And somebody else working on Frank working on with model making and with Gary Technologies stuff allows him to change what he can think of building. You couldn't think of building the building you showed me in Barcelona. Sevilla last night. You couldn't think of doing that if you didn't know you could build it. The knowing you can make it changes what you can think of. I'll sort of close with 3 projects I'm working on now. I don't have a company. I just think up ideas and I con people into helping me. It's a big scam. My life is a scam. But I get things done because people like to paint the fence and pay me for it. And so when I was 26 years old, a long time ago, 50 years ago, I realized I didn't know how big cities were. And I tried to find it out a little bit. I couldn't find it out. So with some students, I made clay models, plasticine models, kindergarten clay, that non-hardening clay that you use that's sort of greenish. They call it white, but it's sort of greenish color. And I made models of 50 cities of the world. And I established I would just get some masonite 17 inches because I knew if I photographed it, it would be 8.5 inches. 8.5 inches is the size of a book you can make easily. You could print it. I worked backwards from the fact I was going to do a book out of it. So I got some masonite, and I got this clay, and I made models with the students of cities. But some cities were 12 of these panels, and some were 1. They were all the same scale. I made these all the same scale. And I was shocked that Paris was so big and some other cities were so small, and that Rome was so much smaller than Paris, and Angkor in Cambodia was as big as Rome, and so forth and so on, actually bigger than Rome. And Berlin is so big, and others are. It was really fascinating. I mapped a third of Tikal, the oldest and the largest of the Mayan cities, when I was 21. I mapped a third of it in the jungle in Guatemala the first season there. And I was shocked that it was so small. I've always been interested in maps. I've done a lot of atlases. A number of my books are atlases. And medicine and atlases and information theory most of the time. And so then a few years later, I did a book on 20 cities in America doing deep statistical. This is before computers, in 1967. For MIT, a huge atlas of 20 American cities. And then I didn't do anything for a while, and now I'm getting to the time when I'm counting backwards from death, and I would like to take this to its fruition, and I've come up with an idea called 1920-21, in which I want to study 19 cities that will have more than 20 million people in the 21st century, and study their urbanism, but study them in a comparative sense. And it turns out that nobody's ever done maps of the cities of the world, or there's no standards for doing maps of the city. Not the same scale, not the same legends. Every legend is different. So some cities, they call it industrial land use, sometimes light industrial, heavy industrial. Sometimes they map the ground floor so it's all commercial, even though the rest of it is residential. The patterns of how a city is made, there's no standardization. There's no standardization of where the edge to a city is, therefore any numbers you find out within the city limits, even if a city, as many large cities do, go over their city limits, like New York goes into New Jersey and to Connecticut. Almost every large city does. Not everyone, but many of them do. This is such a vast city, it doesn't seem to do that. But most of them leak over the side to outside of the how information is collected. And therefore, if you don't have the edge to a city or an algorithm for doing the edge to a city, you don't have an area. If you don't have an area, any numerical information you collect, you can't find out density. So you can't have density of crime, density of quality of air, density of population, of education, of time to work, of anything you might want to know. This probably is not interesting to everybody here, but it's interesting to me. And I am fascinated with understanding, because I think understanding precedes action, and most people are taking action, this project, that project, without understanding. Most action occurs without understanding. I think the president, I just had lunch with Michelle Obama. I told her I'll do one piece of politicking, and that is your president should have a new cabinet position, the Secretary of Understanding. Because I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I asked her questions about health and health things and some money things and some other things. I said, just give me a simple answer to any. Can you explain any of those? Even the beginning first sentence, of course you couldn't. Because none of us can. Nothing is explained. You can't read the front. If I should have brought a news. Often I pull out a copy of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and I say, pick out any story. I'll ask you 3 really non-esoteric questions about any story, and you'll see it's not answered in that story, and you can't answer it. We don't know anything. So I thought the basis, I see you. You can just say it. He says, I'm talking too long.
No.
But I'm not. I'm
just telling you that we're, you know.
I know, but you started late. I didn't.
I know. I'm following you.
Huh? You have to be out. Okay. I'll finish up.
I love people to ask you questions.
Yes. That's what
No. I'm not going to take questions. And I'm going to tell you why I'm not going to take questions. If I asked you how many people would like to ask or think questions should be allowed from an audience, you'd all say yes, because we all want to be part of things. But questions come in 2 varieties, with rare exceptions. They are speeches or bad questions. And I don't want somebody else to give a speech, and I can't stand bad questions. Every once in a while, somebody asks some good question, but they can get me afterwards. And she has a question coming in her phone here. Every so often, somebody asks me a good question, but it's seldom, so I never take questions. You can ask me a question afterwards. Anyway, so I'm doing the result of this, of comparatively mapping and coming up with new mapping systems, and there's some extraordinary ways of cartographically showing in information architecture and 3D printing and all of graphics. There's amazing ways of understanding urbanism and all these things I'm talking about, quite complex ways. And the results of that is creating a series of urban observatories around the world of a different kind of museum. If you could picture a big circle that's made of huge LED screens with a console in the middle, and the console has questions, and you push a question and it's answered comparatively on all the screens about 30 cities or 20 cities around you, that you could see comparatively all this information. And the outside is these LED screens where you see live footage of every festival of every city in the world, and that you could have these in 30 cities. You could have a live museum that's electronic, that's an urban observatory. We're going to build the first sample of this in July in San Diego, and then it's probably going to move to the Smithsonian in Washington. And I'm also going to build another one called FedMed, which is going to be what federal governments do for healthcare, which we don't know. What is the federal policy on healthcare? For instance, Norway, maternity leave is 46 weeks, United States, with pay. In the United States, it's 12 weeks with no pay. It just varies so radically, and we have no idea of success and failure anywhere in the world, and yet it is 20% of the GNP in the world is on healthcare. And it's never been studied comparatively, and they don't go by it. And I'm interested in that, so I'm doing that. So I'm doing that FedMed, and I'll tell you the last thing, and then I'll close. And I felt I hardly started, and I didn't look at any notes yet. I'm going to do one more conference in my life. And it's going to be a 5-week-long conference. But it's only going to be on Mondays. And it's going to be in a different city around the world. So I'm making up these cities. We can have the first one in Shanghai, the next one in Delhi, the next one in Berlin, the next one in Chicago, the next one in wherever. 5 one-day conferences. And it's going to be called Prophecy, with an S, which is the verb in English. And there's only going to be a one-day conference with 5 speakers, each given a little over an hour speech, highly controlled, lots of AV, see, the opposite of what I just did, right? See? And I'm going to get extraordinary people to give a prophecy for the next dozen years in a very narrow subject, whether it is power or a medical thing or space travel, and I can get the best people in the world. 2 will come from that region, 3 I will invite, but I'll pick those 2 from that region from a list of 10 that that region gives me. And it'll be just a one-day conference on prophecy. And for 5 weeks, you'll see 25 prophecies that are constructive, not gloom and doom, and we're going to end up in fire or the Mayan calendar or something. And that's my next conference, to do a global conference. Thank you very much. You've been very nice.